Just one thing for any of the participants, if you would like a PDH certificate for this presentation, please email me following the presentation and we'll get that out to you. So I'm just going to say a couple of things. First, I wanted to recognize Jared Esselman as the project champion at UDOT, and also the technical advisory committee, which played an important role in the research, which includes Paul Damron and Craig Ide, who are also UDOT staff people, and also Stephen Lay from Utah Valley University, who is participating today as mountain bike rider. Hi, Stephen. And also John Salmon at BYU. So thank you to the TAC for your participation. So at this point, I'm going to just introduce the principal investigators. The lead for Utah State University is Regan Zane, who is in the upper left on my screen. And then below him on my screen is Karsten Christensen with EPS. And I'm gonna hand it over to you guys. And I know that you're timed your presentation so that we'll have time for Q&A toward the end.
Yep. Yeah, that's the plan. Thanks for handing it over to us. Regan, would you care to introduce your team and then maybe I can introduce the EPS team?
Sure. I'll just highlight, as was just mentioned, my name is Regan Zane. I'm the director of the Aspire Research Center here at Utah State University, and I really had the pleasure of coordinating this project with EP Systems. We had multiple team members that were involved here at Utah State. We've listed each of the key ones here. In particular, we had 3 students, Cami Champlin, Jackson Morgan, and Hossein, who were all involved, both undergraduate and graduate students. And so we certainly value their inputs, and they were a tremendous part of the team. We also have an additional faculty member, Professor Ziki Song, who was involved from the transportation modeling side. So it's been great to work here with Utah State. And Karsten, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. I understand that I've broken my screen that I'm sharing. So I'm going to kind of work on that in the background as I'm presenting here. So hang on just one second. I do apologize for my delay. First of all, though, probably good to say that we've really enjoyed working with the Aspire team. Learned a lot of really good things from that team and their expertise. Also, we've thoroughly enjoyed working with UDOT with our TAC. Thank you for sponsoring us. I want to recognize first the core team here, but also I know Nate, I just saw you hop on. Nathan Millicum is our CEO here at EPS, and we're thankful that he's here with us today. I know that this is near and dear to his heart as well. So Nate, I don't know if you would like to introduce yourself at all or if that's sufficient.
I think that works. I'd love to hear what you guys did.
All right. Awesome. Okay. So let's do this. If you guys will forgive a slight informality because I can't seem to get the presentation mode to work correctly, I'm just going to present in this format. The rest of our team, we were really, I think, fortunate to have Stephen Hall, our Director of Product Management, work with us. He did a lot of the background research in terms of understanding the disposition of the different flight segments towards electrification here in the state and also, you know, at a national and international scale. So he's been integral to this team. Myself, of course, in my background's in systems engineering. We had our very talented intern, Thomas Payne, who's not with us today. He's in class, but he was a key contributor. And then Dave Koch, also with our business development team and focused on the development of charging infrastructure, ground support systems for electrified flight. Dave Christensen, my dad, and our Director of Government Relations, and then Dallin Dahl was our program manager. So that's our team here at EPS. It's been an excellent collaboration, I think, between everybody. And so without further ado, Regan, I think I'll just hop in and start presenting. So I'll be our primary presenter today. We'll obviously have members of the team here who can hop in and add clarification, in particular during the Q&A session. And then I think, as was mentioned, we'll try to save most of Q&A for the end of the meeting. But if you do have a pressing question or clarification, then go ahead and hop right in, and we'll accommodate that. I am going to try to go into presentation mode one more time, and if that fails, I'll come back here to this format. Okay, you guys tell me, am I on the little tiny narrow screen, the vertical screen, or am I on the correct screen here?
It's
It's
the
a tiny and
smaller
narrow.
screen, so I think the previous version was better.
Okay, sounds good. Well, darn it all. But I guess it is what it is. And you'll just have to forgive the lack of animations here in our presentation. Okay, perfect. So start with the problem statement and the design space that we're looking at here. Electric aviation is really here. It's arrived as a viable technology via advancements in battery capability and motor capability, and new development in distributed propulsion systems. Utah, as a state, recognizes that, EPS obviously, and as a representative of industry, and Aspire as a representative of academia, all recognize that. The question is, how do we begin to not only adapt to the advent of these technologies, but really take control of the situation and optimize the development of our infrastructure to accommodate these advancements in technology and this new kind of renaissance in aviation. We realize, and I think we all realize here on this call, that strategic preparation is key to realizing not only success as this market develops, but also to mitigate risks, to prepare for intelligent, deliberate growth, to prepare our state's economy and society for this new and amazing set of technologies. Want to highlight some of the potential value too in electric aviation. One of the big things that we key in on at EPS is not only that electric aviation is very sustainable from an environmental perspective, but that it also promotes a lot of opportunity within society, right? The accessibility of fast, efficient, easily accessible and readily available transportation that can move you from a rural zone, for example, to an urban center for shopping or business or whatever, opens up a lot of new opportunities for individuals who really haven't had those opportunities. And so again, the intent here is not only to advance the technology, but to create new opportunities for the people who live in our state and around the world. So we need to understand this space. We need to understand what's occurring, how this new ecosystem develops, and how it impacts the existing ecosystem, the existing transportation ecosystem. So our objectives with this research were to design, kind of make a plan for this plan, this Utah statewide electrification plan framework. We call it USweep. And the framework is a plan for electrifying airports and understanding the impacts of airport electrification on adjacent sectors, everything from public health and air quality through to total cost of ownership for these vehicles, through to the effects on the electrical grid as well, and how the existing grid can accommodate these new changes to demands at and around the airports. In order to accomplish that, right, we have to anticipate future energy demands. We have to be able to forecast with reasonable reliability and confidence what electrified aviation will look like, how it will develop within the state, and then evaluate the business models and the implications for how charging infrastructure can be owned. Is it state owned? Is it privately owned? How can that affect the rollout of these technologies? So let me move to one more thing, just for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with the program. In terms of deliverables, we not only created this framework, but delivered a report that identified basically what I just summarized here. It identifies phase-specific data. So these flight forecasts for pilot training segments in aviation, for thin haul and commercial aviation in and around the state, and for advanced air mobility, or AAM, development within the state, and looks at those in the context of kind of a preliminary airport power and energy demand requirement set for the charging infrastructure that would be required to support each of those segments. It includes additionally some preliminary analyses in those regards, understanding kind of the cause and effect between, a certain number of flights in each of those segments at a given airport, creating a new demand that may or may not be met by existing grid capabilities at or around that airport. It also includes a flight corridor impact assessment, so understanding how new modes of aviation transportation may affect existing flight corridors within the state, especially in and around Salt Lake County with the international airport there. And then finally, it presents this framework, kind of a map showing all of the different ecosystem components that affect or are affected by the advent of electrified aviation. So encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a look at that report. I know that it's published via UDOT now, Bob, which was exciting to see. Bob or myself or Regan are more than happy to provide a link to that at any time. Bob,
Yeah.
did you have something you wanted to comment on there?
Just that I put the link in the chat.
Perfect. There you go. All right. So let me jump into our project methodology and findings. I think some of the really exciting part. Here's a summary of how we approach the program from left to right. So we started with the statewide aviation electrification forecast. And really that's understanding three key segments. First, flight school or pilot training electrification. There are, as you're all aware, I'm sure, a number of flight schools within the state. My understanding is that Utah accounts for just north of 10% of the entire country's new pilots that are entering the workforce. And so that's a hefty segment coming from our state. And there are, hundreds, well, if not hundreds, dozens of aircraft flying in and out of each of those flight schools, maybe in some hundreds of aircraft. That could be electrified, and the flight schools see a very interesting and appealing opportunity to reduce their operational costs by switching to electric, but also, to situate themselves uniquely as kind of the locus for electrified aircraft pilot training in the country. So that's one segment. Another segment is kind of the thin haul commercial short range operations. So that would be, as an example, Vernal to Provo, or St. George to Cedar City to Salt Lake, or Twin Falls, or Boise to Logan to Salt Lake. Kind of those smaller regional flights that can serve a number of passengers, or often operate as cargo transporters. So that's an industry of interest due to the ability of kind of electrified technology to accommodate those operating profiles. And then finally, and maybe the hot topic issue in terms of the hype curve is advanced air mobility. Understanding how air taxi services, as an example, can operate in the context of our existing transportation ecosystem within the state. So we start there. Then we move to understanding the power and energy demand that each of those forecasts and each of those segments creates at airports in the state. So there's an air traffic assessment, of course. You see that there at the top. There's an electrified airports forecast, so which airports could support or would probably, given existing traffic patterns, support electrified flight. There's this electrified aviation power and energy demand forecast, which is at each of those airports. What is the demand? How fast does charging need to be provided? How much energy needs to be provided? And then, as I said, at what rate that energy needs to be provided at any point during the day. And then from there, you can progress into basically an assessment of, well, what is the grid currently capable of at each of those locations? And what would it need to be capable of on a yearly basis between now and 2030? And then there's the analysis for what does the deployment of that recommended infrastructure look like, right? How could that be implemented with different technologies? So I'll summarize each of those points as we go on. That information then progresses into the development of the USweep framework, which, as I mentioned earlier, kind of has three key elements. There's the business case exploration. What could this look like in terms of monetizing it, in terms of managing it commercially? What are the opportunities for techno-socioeconomic synergies between electrified aviation and other adjacent segments in our transportation ecosystem? And then what is our recommended plan for future research? I think that that's really key, and probably something that this group is interested in is what happens next? We have this framework. What analyses, what activities need to be conducted next to capitalize on the plan that has now been created? So I'll come to each of those in summary as we go through this presentation. Let me start with our statewide electrified aviation forecast. So you see on the right in the image kind of three phases, and I mentioned those. One is the training fleets, one is commercial thin haul, and one is advanced air mobility. Each of those viewed in isolation from the other is interesting by itself, but really I think that the value comes in understanding the aggregate effects of each of those as they happen or develop simultaneously within the state. So a couple of points before I kind of show an illustration of that. What do those look like? Well, for training fleets, it's university-sponsored flight school operations at USU, UVU, and SUU. Those are the three schools that we used and interviewed and worked with to develop the forecast. For thin haul and commercial operations, as I mentioned, it's kind of that small-scale cargo and passenger operations between local airports. We used Alpine Aviation as kind of a case study there. And then for advanced air mobility, it's the electric air taxi operations between points of interest along the Wasatch Front. We chose to focus our forecast for AAM along the Wasatch Front exclusively instead of looking, down in, for example, the national parks area, which is another area of potential interest for AAM operations, I know, just because there's a sufficient amount of existing infrastructure there to kind of give us a good understanding not only of where traffic could flow, but also what the grid's capacity is. In some of those less developed areas, I think that it's a little bit more speculative. So we wanted to use existing data as much as possible for this forecast. And then what are the different kind of aircraft that we're looking at here? Well, for flight schools, as an example, for pilot training programs, the Diamond DA-40 is an excellent example. Both UVU and Utah State operate a number of DA-40s. Diamond has announced in collaboration with EPS actually that they will be developing, they're actually already developing and will be releasing an EDA-40, an all-electric purpose-built electric training aircraft with some fairly impressive specs. I encourage you to check that out on their website. For thin haul and commercial, there are a number of different aircraft that are under development. A few that I just wanted to call out here that we use specifically: the Tecnam Traveler P-Volt, a hybridized Cessna Caravan, and a hybridized Beechcraft Air King. All of these are already operating as standard, internal combustion fueled aircraft within the state and along these routes. And so it's just a question of how do those become electrified. And then for AAM, there is an even larger space. Some common names that you may have heard in the past and with which EPS is familiar. In the eVTOL space, eVTOL standing for Electrified Vertical Takeoff and Landing space. Joby is certainly an industry leader. Archer, another one. Vertical Aerospace, Embraer Eve, Lilium, Airbus, Supernal, among others. So there, it's a question of taking all of the various capabilities for those aircraft and aggregating them into something representative that we can use. Let me hop down and provide a visual for what this kind of looks like. Flight school operations, as you may be aware, are kind of centered on a home base airport. And so in blue on this chart, you can see at SUU, for example, you could see 20 flights per day for electrified aircraft. At UVU, you're talking a much larger volume of flights in and around Provo Airport and their satellite airports. Spanish Fork is an example of up to 68 flights per day, and this is by 2030, right? There's kind of a ramping up that occurs, but by 2030, we're estimating 68 electrified flights per day out of UVU's flights going Provo Airport. USU's similar numbers out of Logan Airport, 54 flights per day. So by themselves, those segments they're kind of isolated, right? And you could potentially just electrify that home base airport, maybe some of the satellites to support those operations. But then you add on thin haul and commercial operations. And so there's kind of two corridors within the state for thin haul and commercial. There's a north-south corridor represented in purple here, and then an east-west corridor represented in orange. And you see some of the major hubs there. Obviously, Salt Lake Airport in the center is kind of a major hub, but Vernal within the state, St. George, and Cedar City, Wendover, Logan is another one there. Provo is another one. It's kind of smashed there in the middle between everything else. But Provo is a big one. South Valley Airport. Those are a few of the key airports in that network. And you see there, obviously they're longer range, but many of those flights still cross paths with the airports that are already being electrified at this point for flight school operations, right? Provo, Logan, Cedar City. So there's opportunity for synergy there as we see it. And you see in terms of number of flights along the east-west corridor and the north-south corridor together, up to 185, almost 200 flights per day. And those are high energy consuming flights. They're not small little hops, skips, and jumps. Those are long range, and so they require a lot of energy, and the airports have to be able to provide that. And then finally, AAM, as I mentioned, our focus there was along the Wasatch Front, primarily from Weber County down south through Utah County and Salt Lake County, kind of in the center west over to Summit County and Wasatch County in the east. So you see Park City as a potential location there. And what's interesting is those are shorter flights, but they have to operate on a much faster schedule. And so, the ability for whatever airport or charging location, vertiport, if you will, is supporting their operations, they have to provide a certain amount of energy, but it's really how fast can they provide that energy to allow AAM operations to continue uninterrupted. And so it's a little bit different challenge, but the potential volume there is huge. Just looking at a case study with a few representative operators operating in and around Salt Lake Airport or between areas of interest like ski resorts or, the Point of the Mountain area, north and south of the Point of the Mountain, there between Salt Lake and Utah counties, up to 336 flights per day. And again, happy to review the data in detail with anybody who would like to or to read the report. But, all told, by 2030, potentially 660 flights per day in and around the state across these various segments. And each of those flights requiring, multiple kilowatt hours of energy, many kilowatts to charge appropriately at each airport, on time at each airport. So it's not a small proposition within the next 10 years to accommodate this developing industry. That's just the flights generally per week. Now, if we look at them in terms of existing structures, right, routes, what is the impact on the existing air traffic patterns within the state? So we conducted an assessment there, especially targeting AAM and thin haul operations. I'll start with thin haul on the right of this slide, simply because most of what we're seeing is probably a replacement of existing operations as opposed to the addition of a ton of new flights, right? So you can see on the right there, per each route, potentially 1 to 3 additional flights daily coming in and out of Salt Lake on each of these routes. That is an impact, of course, and it would need to be accounted for, but it's not on the scale of what you see with AAM, where it's a completely new industry, right? It is a completely new operating schema. And so you have an additional 330 flights per day in Salt Lake Valley alone, right? Salt Lake Valley and Utah Valley and a little bit north of Salt Lake as well. How does one regulate that space? That's one of the items that we propose needs to be accomplished in short order, is developing a plan for regulating this airspace. On the left there, you can see that I've kind of outlined the class, I believe it's Class C and Class B airspaces around Salt Lake Airport. And most of these flights cross into those spaces. And so not only is it a lot of traffic, but it's a lot of traffic in an already congested area. So we see that as a key to success for the state is preparing a plan to regulate the airspace as these new modes of transportation develop. Let me talk to you briefly about the impact now on the electrical grid. So taking Salt Lake Airport as a case study, here on the left, we see that urban airports that are already situated in well-developed areas um, probably wouldn't absolutely need um, a lot of grid augmentation initially, in the next 1 to 2, 3 years. Obviously, as we move towards 2030, adding an additional, as you see on the left, 6,500 kilowatts of demand at any given time at the airport is going to require an infrastructure upgrade. But relative to the total capacity within a 1 mile radius of that airport, almost 30,000 kilowatts, and the estimated available capacity at any given time during the day, it's something that's manageable. But if now you switch over and start looking at rural airports, and this is what our charts here on the bottom of the page show you, with the exception of Vernal Airport, places like Price or Parowan simply don't have the infrastructure to accommodate these new modes of flight, the electrified, aviation. Price, for example, has an estimated available capacity around that airport of, I think it's like 12 kilowatts. And they would need on the order of 150 to 200 kilowatts just to accommodate the flights moving in and out of that airport on that east to west corridor that I showed. Parowan is similar, right? Some of these aircraft, because they may be fully electric, may initially have a limited range compared to existing internal combustion engine aircraft, and so you have to accommodate the demand for recharge, fast recharge, so they can continue their routes at airports that generally don't see as much traffic. For example, Parowan and Price. But then again, I just want to recap: at urban airports, the capacity is much higher. Now, Regan's team were the primary drivers on this analysis. So Regan, I want to make sure that you have the ability to comment both here and on the next slide where we start looking at a case study of how infrastructure could be rolled out at airports. Would you like to jump in for a minute?
Hey, Karsten, I appreciate that. You're doing great. And let's keep this going forward, and I'll provide response to any questions.
Okay, sounds good. So that's just kind of a general overview then of demand at these airports. What does it look like then when you try to roll out actual infrastructure? Not only updating the grid, but also charging infrastructure, whether that be fixed or maybe mobile assets, grid augmentation infrastructure like solar or wind options. This is an interesting analysis. So if you look on the bottom left, we start with a base case. And again, this is at Salt Lake Airport. There are 3 scenarios that we analyze here. The first one is based on our forecast. If Salt Lake Airport had to support all of this electrified flight over the course of, I think, any given month, then maybe they're looking at a price, as you see in the bottom left, based on Rocky Mountain Power's. Now I can't remember the name of the schedule. Sorry, Regan, if you remember the name of the charge schedule that we're looking at here, pop in with it. But basically, on the order of 48 cents per kilowatt hour in terms of energy to support the electrified flight that we forecasted coming in and out of Salt Lake City Airport. Now, the second case that we look at is, what if you supported the same flight, but you had some kind of microgrid asset there at the airport? So, a fuel truck equivalent, for example, we call it a mobile microgrid here at EPS, where it's effectively a fuel truck filled with batteries that charges during off-peak hours at the airport, and then charges the aircraft instead of pulling directly from the grid from that microgrid. Are there cost savings involved? And our analysis shows that yes, there are, up to 7.2% savings, which over the course of a month translates to thousands of dollars. Over the course of a year, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so there are huge potential savings for operators to look at how they want to develop infrastructure. The third case that we look at here just proves that point even more. Now we have some kind of microgrid, and we're offsetting the grid's capability with an alternative power generation means, in this case, solar. So we factor in the cost of the microgrid and the cost of the solar options. And still we see a reduction of, another 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So now we're talking savings of up to 15%, relative to the base case where we're only plugging directly into the grid to charge these aircraft. I think this is telling because it shows us that being deliberate, working with these airports individually and collectively as a group to optimize their infrastructure rollout in anticipation of electric aviation's development and advent, is something that could be very appealing to them, right? It can save many thousands of dollars over the course of months and years of operations. And so this is, again, one of those areas where we've done some preliminary analysis, and we highly recommend continuing this analysis in detail on a per airport basis. Moving on now, let me talk to you about the framework. So I'm I'm pulling in all of these different areas within our transportation ecosystem: regulation of flight traffic, the grid that supports energizing this transportation, the airports that have to operate and accommodate this new form of transportation. So what is our framework, our plan for approaching this new technology and implementing it into our state's economy? What does this look like? So let me outline it first. Tier 0, kind of the core of the framework, is the information that we've gathered around electrified aviation industry, right? So what are the capabilities of aircraft? When will those aircraft be released and become available and begin to proliferate, as an example? And then adjacent to that is, what is the forecast? Based on the availability of those aircraft and demand for those aircraft across these different segments, when do we begin to see widespread adoption and use of these technologies? And where do those technologies, kind of come into play in geographically at airports, at, as of now, non-existent vertiports in urban centers? Where do we need to prepare for aviation, and how electrified aviation, and how much of it do we need to prepare for? So that's kind of the first stage of the framework. But then we move kind of a layer out in the transportation ecosystem, and we look at the impact on flight traffic based on where these aircraft are flying. We looked at the impact on operational total cost of ownership for both private and commercial operators, and potentially even public operators for these aircraft, if we're looking at the flight schools as an example. And then we look also at the impact on the electrical grid. We kind of talked through each of these already in some detail, but there's a lot of room for additional analysis and exploration to really understand this space well. And then you can move out yet another layer, another tier, and look at the impacts on environmental quality, on surface transportation even, right? As we introduce AAM as a new mode of, ubiquitous transportation that anybody can use at a reasonable cost, how does that impact how vehicles on the road move? Or if, transporting goods via kind of that via electrified flight becomes less expensive than transporting them on highways in truck routes, or maybe not even less expensive, but in some kind of niche cases becomes available as an option, does that impact heavy duty transport traffic along our key arteries? So there's a huge potential impact and set of synergies between aviation and surface transportation. There's also, and it's not listed on here, it's listed as an outcome actually, but there is the impact on society too, that needs to be understood. As these new modes, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of our presentation, as these new modes of transportation become ubiquitous, become easily accessible to people everywhere, does that open up new opportunities for economic development in rural areas within the state? Does it open up new opportunities for mobility in traditionally less privileged populations, for example? That all needs to be understood and planned for. And I think that if we do plan for it, it puts the state in an excellent place, not only to cope with this new set of technology, but to thrive and to be a leader and an example in the context of the future of transportation, which I know is a priority for the state. So let me give you an example of what we've outlined in the framework, just so you understand the level of detail that we've gone to. This is kind of an assessment of the potential research activities and lessons or information that could be gained by examining the impact of electrified aviation on the electrical grid. And what you see kind of highlighted in blue are areas that during this study we began some preliminary analysis on, but that certainly still have room for ample exploration. So there's the investment in the upgraded electrical grid that has to be understood. So what needs to be installed? And then there are economic opportunities associated with that could be assessed. There's opportunities to understand additional grid capability. And so you can create a forecast for what grid usage would look like in the future. Not listed there, but adjacent to that is, again, how that can be monetized and executed. Is it a partnership with a utility? Is it something else? We need to look at that. Down at the bottom of this, again in the middle and highlighted in blue, is the analysis of investment in fixed versus mobile asset charging infrastructure. If this is something, for example, that the state intended to contribute to initially or subsidize, then are there assets that the state could invest in that can be used in multiple locations as the need is identified, right? Those mobile microgrid, those kind of fuel truck equivalents for airports. That are more efficient than just installing fixed infrastructure, as an example. So there's a lot of detail here, and on the right-hand side, you see the potential outputs, the potential knowledge that can be gained by each of these research activities, right? Recommended plans for grid upgrade investments, cost estimates to understand upgrades to the electrical grid. I'm just going down the list, highlighting a few here. The cost to develop charging infrastructure as well, whether it's an existing technology that has to be installed or a new technology that has to be developed to accommodate demand at a certain airport. And then obviously, and of great value to you as planners and orchestrators of this, are what are the savings opportunities, projected timeline to recover investments and to capitalize upon them. So there's a lot of detail, and for each of those segments within the ecosystem that I outline here, we have a similar level of detail proposed for how to progress through understanding the impact of electrified aviation on that segment. And then again, talking about outcomes, I kind of already touched on this, but there are so many opportunities here for techno-socioeconomic synergy. A few that I want to highlight, as you can see listed. Commercial and business development around new AAM hubs. Do those become, not only a center for transportation, but also for sharing of ideas, sharing of, other assets, commercial, as I said, or economic segments? Do they become business hubs where, people who are traditionally working up in, the North Salt Lake region can come down into the Point of the Mountain region easily, without, transiting that highly congested segment of the highway, and thus we open up new opportunities for collaboration and development within the state. Grid infrastructure updates or upgrades can be coordinated between aviation transportation, airborne transportation, and surface transportation, so that we have charging stations that support both segments of transportation. I think also another one, the third one here, is that aviation really adds a third dimension of flexibility to public transportation too. Public transportation and mobility strategies. Does this all have to be privately or commercially operated? No. Can this complement front runner schedule, as an example? That there are opportunities there that should be looked into. So there's a few things. I've already highlighted the opportunity to vitalize rural and at-risk communities. I don't want to beat on that one too much, but it is an incredible opportunity. So, as we look at the business case considerations, closing out the conversation here, I think it can be divided, as any business case can, into three main areas: cost and investment, ownership models, and anticipated returns. What do you have to put in? How does it operate? And what do you get out of it? And I think that I've sufficiently highlighted a lot of those areas, but it is a driver across every segment of our economy and society. Whether it's opportunities for, research and innovation on our campuses, whether it's opportunities for additional mobility and opportunity for the people that live in the state, whether it's opportunities for, new commercial investment, to continue to invigorate our economy. I think that all of these are potential returns for this process. Let me just then highlight something that I've kind of already touched on again, but what happens moving forward? So what you see in left and circled in the red 1 is kind of what we've begun to accomplish here with this program. It's that tier 0 phase 1 of this forecast analysis. From there, we recommend first understanding the impact on the electrical grid. That's kind of key. Infrastructure is expensive. Infrastructure is, a physical asset that has to be developed and invested in. So the first priority is based on the forecasts, which not only are strong now, but should continue to be developed. But based on these forecasts, how does the grid have to mature? We have to understand that very first. Second, up at the top, and I know that you can't read that, it's really small text, but we have to understand how we're going to regulate this airspace, right? With new air traffic, how do we regulate the airspace? From there, we expand out into, and also like, how does this just impact operations for everybody flying and driving in and around the state? And then third, we have to understand total cost of ownership, both in terms of exploring opportunities for public transportation, but also in terms of facilitating entry into this market by commercial entities. And then fourth, moving into those kind of peripheral areas of environmental quality and surface transportation. What are the opportunities for synergies there? If we invest intelligently, how can we also capitalize on goals that we already have in both of those areas? So that's kind of our projected path forward. It's obviously a lot to understand, but it's a complex ecosystem. As I'm sure you all know, transportation is a very complex ecosystem, moving of people and goods. And this is another, as we said, third dimension that gets added to that. And so it will have implications across the board. And so we see that it's important to do that. In conclusion, just ending with that thought is that there's a lot to learn moving forward. We see huge potential. We see incredible opportunity. And we also foresee that if this is not addressed, there are risks that our infrastructure, our regulatory space will not be able to accommodate the new technology that is being developed that promises all of these amazing opportunities. So with that, thank you for listening. I want to open it up for some Q&A. Bob, we're almost on time, 1 minute late. But we have our team here, both from Aspire and from EPS, to answer your questions, and we're excited to hear them.
Great, thanks, Karsten. Yeah, any questions from the audience? This is the time. I will ask a couple of things I'm kind of interested in, and for the benefit of the non-aeronautics folks in the audience, and I know there are some of them, can you define what thin haul commercial means?
Sure, yeah. Let me run back up to that slide really fast just so that I have a reference point. So it's as it says here, kind of that small scale cargo and passenger operations between local airports. So, a good example of that are the daily routes that run between Denver, Vernal, and Salt Lake or Provo, or the routes that run between St. George, Cedar City, and Salt Lake. Right, they're kind of quick hoppers that run multiple times a day. Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that. UDOT actually had a really good study. It was the Vernal study that looked at thin haul and has a really good definition in there. And it's typically about 200 nautical miles or less. So it's kind of these routes that, again, are more regionally based, 200 nautical miles or less, and typically 19 passengers or less aircraft servicing.
Stephen, it might also be helpful. Can you define why is that different than call aircraft passenger travel today compared to, say, a 737 or maybe more of a regional or other type of aircraft that we're used to?
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with the operational cost of it, right? So the larger aircraft, the 737s, and these narrow bodies versus and wire body aircraft, if they can fit more passengers, they want to fly further, and they can amortize the passenger seat per mile over that. What we've seen historically, right, is these smaller regional routes become more costly because you have less volume of people. That's aircraft typically come to this, a hub and spoke um, type model, and these regional routes are then kind of feeder routes in there with less passenger volume on them, which make them more expensive. So you see that with the United States, subsidizing a lot of those routes initially as things transition, and then you see a lot of the large um, airliners like Deltas and American, United, they subcontract out, to the SkyWest and the others, these smaller routes with smaller planes that right now are currently serviced with, an NERJ 175 or some of these like 50, 80 passengers or less. And so why it's significant is there's still all these routes, and electrification with the different cost economics of the operational aspect there can open up these new routes and make them operationally viable, where with traditional aircraft fleets today just don't close always on the business case. And that's what that Vernal study actually goes through, and it talks through the cost of operating a route like that, the cost of the aircraft, and then it talks about and and it walks through the operational and business case there. And where this comes in is electrification now changes those operational cost assumptions behind it. Nate, do you have anything else you want to add, or is that?
I think that's great.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. That was very complete. And I know that this is one of the major findings of the work, but I just thought I'd ask again, just so everyone's aware of it. Of these three levels, so the flight school, the thin haul, and the advanced air mobility, kind of roughly how do they relate, or how do they compare to each other with regard to electrical demand?
It's a great question. Stephen, you want to take that one too? Regan, I'm also happy to.
To clarify the question, are you talking about as far as total energy consumption between the three
Yeah,
at the different airports?
yes.
I'll give a first stab, and then maybe we're going to let you take the next stab. So in the data that goes through, and it really just depends on what the airport is, right? So your Logan Airport, Provo Airport, and Cedar City, where you have heavy, training fleets, are actually going to probably be some of your highest energy demands there, and that's really because they might have a fleet of 20 aircraft that are flying, up to 20 aircraft that are flying 4 to 6 flights a day, and replenishing all that energy. Then other larger hubs like a Salt Lake, where it's kind of more of a hub, where now you're getting some regional and AAM converging in there, that those are going to start multiplying and cause that increased demand. So really, I guess it's kind of route specific and utility specific between the two. I think it's hard to just compare apples to apples on it, but it really depends on what's the economic routes of what's driving there, and then the use cases from that.
Yeah, I think simply put, in order from highest demand to lowest demand, especially over the next 8 years or so, it goes flight schools, AAM, and then thin haul, and then commercial regional.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I understand now that looking at this at an airport by airport basis really makes more sense. But I was looking at more of the global view. I mean, if you were to look out to 2030, how would the global view look then, Karsten?
I think that just two of those switch place, and AAM is at the top of your list, followed very closely still by flight schools, and then followed by the thin haul commercial operations.
Okay.
And the only reason, just to clarify, the reason why thin haul and commercial is at the bottom of that list is because their operations are so spread out, right? So at any one airport, they don't have a huge effect. Obviously, in aggregate, they still require a lot of energy to operate, but it's spread out over a much larger region.
Yeah, and I just to add, this study kind of looked out to about a 2030 time frame. As the technology continues to mature and those markets and industries continue to develop, you will see that flip flop, right? Where more traditional to today, where if AEM, hits the volumes that they're talking about, and then that thin haul, you would see increased demand in the 2030s on those types of markets.
Yeah, it kind of, here we go. This is I think a good chart, right? To kind of illustrate that. The first to enter the market basically now are these pilot training operations. And then small airline is that kind of thin haul commercial segment, followed by eVTOL. So that's where you see the curves start to kind of change and overlap each other.
Yeah, it's entry to market, and then it's also the capacity. A fixed wing trainer is on the order of magnitude of 100 kilowatt hour battery pack. eVTOL is probably twice that. And those regionals, all electric regional can be 500 kilowatt hours to a megawatt hour, depending on the size. So yeah, I think it really depends on the timeline. I think really what drives it is the initial adoption of the trainers, followed by the eVTOL, and then eventually, the large batteries of the regional will consume a lot of electricity.
Great, thank you. Questions from anyone else in the audience? Now, I know Jared Esselman was live a little while ago, and now we just have his photo. But let me just ask Jared if you're there. Is there anything you'd like to say as the project champion?
Sorry, Robert, I had a congressman in my office.
That seems important.
Yeah, Congressman Owens is just passing through. So I apologize. You're gonna have to ask that question again.
I was just kind of throwing it open to you as the project champion. Anything you'd like to say about this project and how the Division of Aeronautics will respond?
Well, I will say this, and most of the people on this call already know it. This was a first step, and I think you showed that slide a couple slides ago, the different steps. I think it's slide 22. And while I think this is the first step, we're already working on step 2 with the Department of Energy. And I see, with Vernal and with Logan and putting it into the ACIP, this is the start of something much bigger. That's my 2 cents on this, is that this is the start of something much bigger. This is the start of ACIP projects. This is the start of Department of Energy grant funding that we're going to ask for. And I think without this, those things aren't possible. So.
Great, thanks. I'll give the audience one final shot at any questions before we close up.
My one question, Robert, is when are we allowed to post or publish this or talk about it? I'm assuming we already are, because it's the final presentation.
Yes, and you are free to do so. The final report has been published, and the link to it I put in the chat, but I can also send it to you, Jared, if you can't access it.
Yeah, will you send it to Scott Romney and myself?
Will do.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just close things off here. Nice job to the research team. Of the UTRAC grants in 2021, this is the first to finish. So you're first across the finish line. So we appreciate that. And I think it was very interesting to kind of observe the process, and I think very, very good work. So congratulations on finishing up a great research project. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. Much appreciated. We've enjoyed it.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we have what we need here. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll close out the meeting.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carson. Great job.
Thanks,
Cheers, buddy.
Regan. Dr. Zane.
Thanks.
Hey, good job, guys.
Thanks, Steven.
Hey, by the way, just real quick, are we going to be able to review the recorded copy of this?
Yeah, I will. I'll share that with you, Stephen.
Okay, that'd be great. Unfortunately, I've been hopping between various activities, and unfortunately, I missed about 15, 20 minutes of the meeting, and I'd really like to catch up.
Okay, no worries. I'll share it with you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Bye.
Okay, yeah. So long.
See you guys. Thanks.
Again, Bob.
Yeah, Bob, we'd love that recording as well. So thank you.
Okay, I'll share it with you guys.
Awesome.